Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this privilege. When Murray asked me to give my testimony today, I wondered what I would talk about, from my life, because I really needed to think about what I could leave out, because as that song said and as Kerry prayed, God's goodness and faithfulness have followed me all my life. Being a follower of Jesus Christ for nearly 60 years means there are hundreds of stories of his goodness to me that I could share, but it would take a while to tell. So to begin at the beginning, I was not brought up in a happy home, and my parents did not attend a church, although my siblings and I were sent to Sunday school because my father said a little bit of God is good for kids. But it was through Sunday school at Clempton Park Baptist Church that I encountered a very personal Jesus Christ. So at age 18, I committed my life to him and was baptised by immersion. It was also there that I met and married the love of my life, Keith. So this is actually a shared story because the last 55 years have been in partnership with my beloved husband. So to backtrack a little, after completing the Leaving Certificate at school, I was employed for 2 years as a clerk with the Royal Australian Navy. Boring job. And then I received a late scholarship to Wagga Teachers College, and they were wonderful years. During that time, Keith committed his life to Jesus and in response to God's direction, changed his career ambitions from marketing to teaching. We married in December 1970. As a newly married couple, we were posted to teach at Narrandera in the Riverina, Keith in the high school, me in the primary school. And there we became foundation members of the Little Baptist Church, whose congregation consisted primarily of young couples. Keith and I took with us a Bible that had been a gift from the church on our wedding day, and this verse was written in the flyleaf, Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't rely on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your path. That verse became the foundation stone for our marriage. Its truth has been proven multiple times as we have in fear and trembling made major life changes when we trusted the Lord's directed path. In Narrandera, we saw God at work in the lives of high school kids. These kids were taught by Keith and Eric Hudson. Eric used to be a pastor here. The kids made commitments to Jesus. One later became a Baptist minister, one a Pentecostal pastor, and one a Catholic priest. We also saw God work in the lives of the many Indigenous kids who came to Sunday school and youth group. We greatly related to the ethos of that little church, which was committed to seeing Narrandera people come to know our wonderful Lord. The church families shared life together, and it was actually a training ground, as for 5 years we had no pastor, so all the preaching and ministries were done by us all. Out of that original congregation, 6 couples went into full-time Christian ministry. Keith and I both enjoyed teaching during our years in Narrandera, although my career was shortened by pregnancy miscarriages until finally our beautiful baby girl, Belinda, was born. Those years were also when Keith and I began to hear the Lord speak to us about cross-cultural overseas mission, mainly through visiting missionaries, but also through repeatedly giving us a particular Bible verse from scripture union readings, devotionals, sermons, and it was Genesis 12, verse 1. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I didn't want to be a missionary. I thought missionaries had to have special giftings. Keith didn't want to either. He had a lot to lose, but that's his story. However, we clung to our marriage verse that we could trust the Lord to direct our paths, and of course he did. So long story short, we moved to Sydney, and during the next 4 years, Keith studied for a Bachelor of Theology degree at Morling College, while also pastoring a church in the western suburbs. They were not easy years, but people came to trust the Lord and the church grew. Our ministry began there with the arrival of our precious baby boy, Benjamin, who was born with a disease that normally killed newborn babies or left them seriously physically and mentally disabled. The miracle of Ben's total healing is another story of God's great mercy to us, and I don't have time for it now. But this healing meant that we were able to keep exploring the possibility of overseas cross-cultural work. During the 4 years in that church, we experienced the Lord as our provider. The student pastor's salary was too paltry for a family to live on, but God reminded us from Matthew chapter 6 not to worry about lack of finances, as your heavenly Father knows your needs. Though we were always broke, we learned that God was our provider over those years as money, often anonymous, came our way. Also a small inheritance and a free car. Though that church grew, we knew that we were being nudged towards the next obedience. Keith, through his college studies, was convicted that we were headed towards overseas service. But in the whole potential world, we didn't know where. Where was to be our place? One evening when Keith was out and the kids were asleep, I begged the Lord with tears to tell us where his path was leading. That night I had a vivid dream. In the dream we walked down the steps of a plane and I saw that we had landed in a tropical place. But it was frightening as there were men in military uniform carrying guns everywhere. They ushered us into a very large corrugated iron building where there were women wearing beautiful long skirts and blouses, which I was later to know as the kain kebaya, a national dress of Indonesia. They served us delicious food, a banquet of Indonesian food, and then I woke. The next morning I told Keith that I'd experienced a dream from God, but not the details, as I needed Keith to hear similarly from the Lord. Some weeks later, I saw that he had extracted an advertisement for language learning from the Sydney Morning Herald, and when I asked him why, he said, well, I'm thinking that if we go overseas, we'll have to learn a language, so it might help if we learn the basics of understanding a foreign language now. I asked him, what language did you have in mind? He said, well, Indonesian seems to be the easiest. So I said, I think I better tell you about my dream. So we applied for candidature with the Australian Baptist Missionary Society. And during the interviewing process, we said we were open to going wherever the organisation directed us. The panel retired for discussion and returned saying, you are accepted candidates, and with your qualifications and life experience, we think the best place for you to serve is for Keith to lecture at the Baptist Theological College in Kota Raja, Irian Jaya, Indonesia. I said, I think I might tell you about my dream. So we were seemingly headed for Indonesia, but there was a problem. Indonesia had experienced a political coup, and the government was suspicious of all foreigners requesting working visas. So our application was ignored, and we waited for the door to open, because God kept reassuring us repeatedly with a verse from Revelation 3, 7 and 8. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. But the door to Indonesia seemed firmly closed. After 2 years, during which time we moved to Regent's Park Baptist Church, Keith said to the Baptist Mission Director, look, something needs to happen. I'm under pressure from this church where I'm currently serving to be their full-time pastor, and we either need to go or stay permanently. So the mission decided to send us to Bandung in Java as on visitors' visas to learn language and culture from an intermission school and pray that our permanent visas would be granted in the 6-week visa-to-visa period. So in 1983, when Ben was 5 and 1 day and Belinda 7, we flew to Bandung, Java. In the early weeks, we read that Revelation verse again, claiming its truth but feeling pretty hopeless and discouraged. One morning, Ben came to me saying, Mummy, God's saying something to me in my mind. He's saying, open the door until I close it. Which door do you think he wants me to open? I said, Benny, I think that's a message for your daddy and me. And surprise, surprise, the next day Our permanent visas were granted. 1983 was a year of adventure and anxiety. We made new friends, we explored the island of Java, we climbed the Temple of Borobudur, which you can't do today, and also the dormant Tangkabuan Ratu volcano, which wasn't really that dormant. We had family members visit. We went to a national wedding, had a motorbike accident. Our neighbour became a Christian. Ben went missing for hours. Belinda was sick with measles. Our house was robbed as we slept. I had a bacterial infection of the heart. Ben was hospitalised with typhoid, and Keith, with amoebic dysentery, when he reached the hospital, was 30 minutes from death. His illness prevented him returning to Australia for the funeral of his brother's baby. It was a remarkably difficult year, but God was faithful and protected us and brought us through everything. During that year, our kids were also remarkable in adapting to very different circumstances. They made friends with neighbourhood children. They delighted in the attention of missionary candidates who became surrogate uncles and aunts. They enjoyed international school. They dressed up and joined in street parades and were just generally happy children. It was a great relief and constant joy to us. We were amazed at their adaptability and resilience. At the end of 1983, we travelled across the archipelago to Irian Jaya, which is West Papua today, where we lived on the Baptist College campus as the only Europeans for the next 6 years in a basic Indonesian house with no air conditioning and no kitchen. The weather was equatorially hot all year, so it's not surprising that none of us now like cold weather. It was a relief to holiday in the cool mountains of the Barlim Valley, where most of the staff lived and worked, and that included Mark and Val Holt, who used to be pastors here. At the Baptist Theological Institute College, Keith lectured mornings and evenings, I taught some English, and our kids rode for an hour by minibus daily to an international school. So they always had friends, Indonesian kids on the campus, Dutch and American at school. During the next during the next 6 years of teaching, we experienced celebrations, weddings, graduations. We were plagued by frequent illness, mainly malaria, but we had a lot of fun. Humour is an international language. And we experienced miracles. God opened an impossible path for our students to take the good news of Jesus to 2 trans-migrant village areas where the people were essentially nominally Islamic, but really animistic. Now 3 Baptist churches survive and thrive there. And how that all began is another story. But we experienced the Lord's goodness and kindness and protection and provision, and sometimes it appeared that we did not see prayers answered. Deaths of missionary colleagues, a missionary child, national people from plane and road accidents and illness meant that we could not lean on our own understanding. We had to trust in the Lord that his ways are not our ways. For many years, advisory medical help was from the mission doctor, who was only contactable twice a day by 2-way radio. But God healed. I have so many stories of God's healing. After 7 years, we prepared to return to Australia, as Keith had actually worked himself out of a job. 3 of our pastors were now in Java studying for master's degrees to come back as lecturers in the college. But you know, the devil had one last swipe at me by attacking me with a huge swarm of mosquitoes. 2 weeks after returning to Australia, I succumbed to malaria and in my weakened state caught glandular fever. I was ill for almost that whole year. Keith had to be away a lot with his work with BMS, but I was cared for by my mother and the wonderful people of Regents Park Baptist Church. They had been so supportive of us for 7 years, but that's another story. One home group through that year fasted for my healing every Monday and then gathered for prayer and Bible study at night. God responded to their faithful prayer and healed me. But how that happened is another story that I don't have time for. During 1990, Keith received invitations from churches to consider a pastoral position, but none seemed right to us. I remember earnestly praying for his path, and my reading that day was Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. I lift my eyes to the hills. My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And I thought, oh, the hills must mean the Blue Mountains. I didn't realise, was completely unaware that Dural was actually in an area known as the Hills. In 1991, the pastoral selection panel at Dural Baptist Church interviewed us and deemed that we might be a good fit. But we looked at our marriage verse and asked the Lord for the rightness of serving at Dural Baptist Church. We put out a test, in the form of our children being accepted into Pacific Hills Christian School, which at that time wasn't possible. So we spent some time of January serving on a beach mission led by Miranda Stevenson's parents. And when we returned, a phone call from Dr. Ted Boyce confirmed that there were unexpectedly places for our children at Pacific Hills. So we accepted the call to Dural Baptist Church pastorate and wondered how God would direct our path. We didn't wonder long. The church grew exponentially and the sports centre was born. The next 13 years were exciting and busy, vibrant and exhausting, as God gave the church wonderful people of skill and gifting who embraced the seeker-sensitive church concept, and there were many conversions. They were demanding but rewarding years. The leadership team changed several times, but we and the congregation were mostly always on the same page about wanting people in our community to know Jesus and his great love. And we had a lot of fun. Those of you who were here will remember parties, Christmas concerts, Wild Boys Brigade camps, sports, Girls Brigade, Kids Club, and a huge kids' church, young people's camps, one involving a lot of mud, weddings, baptisms, and also, sadly, funerals of precious people. Belinda and Tim made their closest friends here. I loved this church. My experience of breast cancer and the kindness of Dural people can never be forgotten. I never wanted to leave here, but in 2003, God said, it's time. Keith was wanted as the National Director of ABMS. Well, you know, if I fought the Lord about going to Indo, this time I really battled him. But he repeatedly gave us the verse Jeremiah 29:11. 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, plans for good and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. But I did not want to leave. And I had the whole pastoral team on my side. They were in agreement that we should not leave. So I put out 3 fleeces or tests. And of course, God responded. And that's another story. So we moved to Melbourne, and it was the most challenging change of my life because we were leaving everything that was precious to us, except our dog. But our wedding verse sustained us. Despite suffering depression, I knew God had good plans because he kept me focused on Jeremiah 29:11. And in 2005, at Val Holt's encouragement, I applied to La Trobe University to do a Master of Counselling course and discovered that this was the career that was the Lord's plan for me. Over the ensuing years in Melbourne and back in Sydney, I experienced his amazing enabling and presence and partnership in my psychotherapy practice. I was deeply grateful to him for returning us to Sydney with Keith's new role as the National Director of the Baptist churches. Friends, I am grateful for my careers. I'm grateful for my overseas life, for my children, my in-law children, my delightful grandchildren, my friends, my wonderful husband, but essentially for Jesus, who repeatedly forgives me, empowers me, and loves me more than I can express. I stay connected to him through the Lectio 365 app, using Encounter with God notes, and being part of a very supportive, faith-filled Bible study group and praying with Keith and others. I'm in the last quadrant of my life, but the adventure continues as I see that I really can trust the Lord with all my heart and not rely on my own understanding, because He always has a perfect path planned for me, as He has for all of us. Thank you for listening.